Welcome to the English Suite Podcast, the voice of Widener English and creative writing. This is Jim Esch. In today's episode, I am joined by English professor Dr. Christine Woody and 4 Widener students who worked with her over the summer on a textual editing project concerning a 19th century Romantic period magazine. Before we start our interview, I wanted to ask everybody to introduce themselves. We'll start with Dr. Woody.
Hi, I'm Dr. Christine Woody. I am a professor here in the English and Creative Writing Department and the director of the Textual Scholarship Certificate Program. I specialize in late 18th and early 19th century British literature, especially print culture, so magazines, periodicals, and all that kind of mess.
I'm Jattu. Right now, I'm double majoring in creative writing and psychology. I'm a sophomore. And yeah, I had lots of fun working on the project over this summer.
I'm Stefan Cozza. I am in double majoring in English and creative writing. And on campus, I am the editor-in-chief of our Widener's literary magazine, The Blue Root, along with being the English Honor Society, Sigma Tau Delta, the president of that.
I'm Cloë Di Flumeri. I'm a junior triple majoring in English, political science, and international relations. I've done a lot of research before, but not a lot of research within the humanities. So this was so cool for me. And I just loved it. I loved working with everyone, getting to know everyone. Me and Jattu are working on another research project together now. So it was great getting to know them and working together. And I had Dr. Woody in class. So it was awesome getting to work one-on-one and with the group. So it's been really great.
I'm Seth. I am an English major with an anthropology minor. I'm a huge nerd. I love Magic the Gathering, Dungeons and Dragons. I worked at a comic book shop for about a year. I had no clue what I was getting into. I just skimmed over what, we'd be talking about with the editing research. I saw that, Professor Woody was heading it and she's rad. And then I saw the names of the students and I knew all them. And I was like, all right, this is a great crew. I'm in good company regardless of what we're doing. I'm sure it'll be a blast. And it was.
I want to turn now to Christine, and your specialty, or one of your specialties, is the Romantic period. And as I understand this project, it has to do with Romantic period periodicals. And so, but how did you get interested in all this, and what specifically are you working on?
Sure. So I'll give you a bit of the intellectual backstory of how I ended up here. So I happened on Romantic periodical writing when I was doing my master's work, and I was interested in a writer named Thomas de Quincey, who writes this bizarre book called The Confessions of an English Opium Eater. And one of the profs I was working with was like, well, why don't you read some book reviews of it? And then I went, and the book reviews were crazy. There was just this desire to almost rewrite what the book was about through the book reviews, where they'd like selectively pull different parts of the book and make it seem like it was a morality tale instead of being, a text kind of celebrating drug culture. And so it was this really fascinating moment. And I went, wow, what is going on in magazines in this period? And that's sort of how I fell in love for me. I think one of the things that jumped out for me as sort of the child of the particular era that I'm from is that these magazines, with their anonymous writing, and often there's like personae that are developed. There's a weird dynamic of almost creating a performance of the world that's like using avatars. Anyway, it reminded me of like LiveJournal that was popular when I was in undergrad, and this whole like blogging culture almost. So it felt that it was a lot more like the internet than it was like, the monolith of the finished book. And so that's sort of how I fell in love with the periodical. So my dissertation work and the sort of book project I'm still working on is thinking about if there's a different model of authorship that comes out of people writing in anonymous spaces, in sort of pseudonymous spaces, in these contested and iterative spaces of the periodical, where it's just not as stabilized, in part because there's not the same copyright, but also because there's not the same named authorship. And so as a result, a text that comes up a lot when you're talking about creative performances of authorship in the early 19th century is this series in Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine called the Noctes Ambrosianae. And that's what we're editing right now. It has a Latin title, which means the Knights at Ambrose's. Ambrose's is a tavern. But it's not in Latin. It's mostly in English, although chunks of it in Scots and some Latin and some French stuffed in there, some fake German we found, fake Danish. But basically, it's a series of satirical dialogues where you get ushered as the reader behind the scenes of this magazine, and you get given what is supposed to look like a view at how the magazine gets written. But it's completely faked. And so there's a character named Christopher North who appears, who's supposed to be the editor, but it's not the real editor. It's just an invented character. And then you've got some contributors who appear in the dialogues, and some of them are real people, like the poet James Hogg, who's already famous. He's appearing in these, and he does contribute to the magazine. But some of them, like Captain Morgan O'Doherty, he's like this weird, like penurious Irish adjutant who just like appears, and he's kind of based on William McGinn, who's a real person, but again, not 100%. And then you even get visits from real historical people who did not approve their appearance in the magazine. So one of our group was editing, it was Chloe, I believe, was editing a number in which Lord Byron appears and shows up and says things that the real Lord Byron would never have said politically. And so it's really this delightful anarchic space where they're basically willing to libel real people and gossip about real people and bring in even fake people. So the number that Seth was editing had characters from a John Galt novel who were just there hanging out and drinking and partying and talking about books. So anyway, that's kind of what we're working on editing, is this really bizarre moment, imagined literary community. And we were kind of trying to think through what are all the cool concepts and questions that we can ask about this literary world and this version of the 1820s world when we get it presented in this particular periodical and in this particularly messy, creative way.
Wow, I have so many follow-up questions. First of all, the magazine was
Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine. So this is William Blackwood, who's a publisher. And he does what a lot of publishers do in the late 18th and early 19th century, which is figure out that you can make more money as a bookseller if you have a magazine. And if that magazine says nice things about the books that you yourself print. And so on some levels, like the genesis of Blackwood's as a project for William Blackwood is like, this is a thing that's supposed to help him make more money. And so he first launches it with different editors than the ones we were looking at. And it's really boring and it kind of bombs. So he fires them. And then he relaunches it in October 1817 with John Gibson Lockhart and John Wilson as the two main editors. And they are funnier, they're meaner, and they therefore produce this like far more controversial product. So the first issue comes out with a fake biblical text that gives the history of the magazine's founding and, you know, insults half the people who work in the publishing business in Edinburgh in the process, and insults morality by imitating the Bible. And so that's how it kind of gets onto everybody's lips to talk about. And they sort of trade in this like semi-scandalous, but also highbrow style. And that's where the Noctes that we were editing come in. They're sort of an outgrowth of that approach. There's no such thing as bad publicity as far as William Blackwood is concerned.
And this magazine, was it, what was its status? Like, was it one of the more prestigious magazines in the literary culture? And are there any like modern parallels? Like, is it like the New Yorker today or something along those lines?
That's a really good question. I like that a lot. So it comes into a field where, in terms of the highest status periodicals, that slot is occupied by two quarterly publications. So there's the Edinburgh Review that was founded in 1802, that is sort of a real tastemaker of the time period. And then there's the Quarterly Review, which copies its format and pretty much everything else. And we know this because we've seen the letters of people who founded it, and they're like writing to each other, we should copy the Edinburgh Review, except be Tory instead of Whig. And so you've got these sort of two massive, and when I say massive, like 250, 300 page magazines that are coming out 4 times a year, or almost 4 times a year. Sometimes they can't keep to their schedule. And it's a hyper polarized political climate. So you have one's Whig and one's Tory, and you kind of know what they're going to say about an author based on that author's political stance. And so Blackwood's comes in as a monthly, so it's cheaper, it's more frequent, it's very middle class in its sort of aim, and it's very British in its presentation. Yes, it's printed out of Edinburgh, but it is actively recruiting and representing perspectives, not just from Scotland, but from England, from Ireland. And so there's this desire to sort of make it this unionist text, but they're ultra Tory in their politics. And you certainly will see, we certainly saw, they're willing to go there against sort of more radical writers to a greater extent even than the quarterly might, that they don't pull their punches in terms of their political opinions, and that extends into their opinions on what they think of certain women and stuff like that. So it is an interesting experience, I think, to work on a text like this from our contemporary moment, because I adore the engagement with persona and the play with how the medium works. I think there's a high degree of brilliance in this text, but politically a lot of the stuff can get repugnant. So it's kind of a strange experience to edit.
How new was magazine culture? Like, just historically, was it not relatively new, or do I have my dates wrong?
I mean, so the 18th centuryists are going to come for me if I say it's new. It's new-ish. You certainly have, the Gentleman's Magazine, which is established early in the 18th century, and that is at the point that we're talking about historically a staid institution. But magazine culture changes post 1802, and this is in part sort of what my book project is trying to talk about. We see a proliferation of magazines. Some very basic things change about copyright and about the cost of paper and things like this. And so these change the availability of magazines. But another really important thing that changes is literacy rates. And so you're seeing a growing middle-class audience, and over, even after the period we're looking at, over the rest of the 19th century, a growing family audience for the magazine. And one of the things we might think of Blackwood's magazine as jumping and negotiating is the magazine moving from being a men's product that you buy and read at your club, right? Or that even your club subscribes to, and therefore it's associated with a really narrow social sphere, to moving into the family home. And a nice anecdote about Blackwood's is that this was the magazine that the Bronte family subscribed to and read and imitated in their juvenilia. So even some of these really famous, 19th century, mid-19th century novelists, we have proof that they read and were influenced by this magazine. There's actually some really kind of delightful parodies of these kinds of texts in their juvenilia.
I was really intrigued by your making connections between like modern blog culture and what was going on, which sounds like a free-for-all back then. Like just anything went. People could libel one another. I was curious to what did the real people think of it? Like, what did Lord Byron think of it when he was being like fictionalized in this Blackwood's magazine? Did they have any recourse at all?
Well, yeah, and for Lord Byron, of course, he has bigger problems.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think I don't know that he noticed or had a problem with this, because he's been a scandal sheet staple since, a decade earlier at the point that we're looking at. But yeah, so interesting details with Blackwood's. A duel was fought over this magazine, and there was no official editor. This was one of their moves, is if we don't have an official editor, then there's nobody anyone can complain to. But John Scott, who edited the London magazine, really wanted to fight somebody at Blackwood's over comments that were made in Blackwood's about the London. And they went back and forth for a while. And anyway, in the end, John Gibson Lockhart, he sends his second to London to fight John Scott, and his second shoots him dead at Chalk Farm. And it's unfortunate because John Scott was doing really cool stuff in the London magazine, and that era kind of ends with his death, and you end up with like a less fun London. But yeah, so it goes up to and including, murder. But in general, you see, there are issues with libel suits that are brought. It's quite a toxic culture. The comment that's made by Percy Shelley is that the Quarterly Review killed Keats. And, Keats did die of tuberculosis, but the point was that the Quarterly Review was really very, very hard and harsh on Keats in their reviews, and that this had in some way, in Shelley's eyes, destroyed his will to live. And it is, in that sense too, I think it has parallels to our modern internet culture, that we can be very hard on each other. And we certainly see that in this time period, that behind the mask of anonymity or pseudonymity, people can be very cruel.
Now you said you're editing the numbers of this magazine, and that's what you worked on with the students here. This might sound like an obvious question, but I think some in our audience might not really know. Like, what do you mean by editing these numbers? Like, what does that involve?
Oh, this is a really good question. Yeah, because what we're doing specifically is we're trying to do a digital edition of a chunk of this series. So the Noctes Ambrosianae series runs to 70 plus installments, or what I'm calling numbers. The reason I'm saying numbers is they're literally labeled number 1, number 2, and so forth. It doesn't come out every month, but it comes out multiple times a year, typically. And so for our edition, we're looking at the first 20, and that's on purpose. One of the things I love about early Blackwoods is their team writing a lot of things. And so you're not having one person producing a particular text where we can stably say, like, this was John Wilson who wrote this, and therefore, it represents his viewpoint in such and such ways. Instead, we know that for these early 20 numbers, there's a whole team writing them. So there's John Wilson, John Gibson Lockhart, James Hogg, William McGinn. You've got a team who are contributing. We can't always know who's responsible for what, and we end up with something that's more kind of messy and creative as a result of that collaborative atmosphere. And so for each one, they're normally about 20 pages in the original magazine volume, and they're written like dialogue. So they look like plays in terms of they have the dialogue tag of who's talking. We have scene division sometimes, stage directions, songs. And what we're trying to do with this edition is two things. One is make this accessible. One of the problems that afflicts people who work on periodicals is that, people are not making a modern edition of the periodical that you can buy the way you can buy a modern edition of a Charles Dickens novel, right? Like you're kind of stuck going back to the original in many cases. And the originals are in some rare book libraries, but not all. And they are in some online databases, but not always super searchable and not always not behind a paywall. And so the goal is to take these 20 and put them together in one place where they're findable. There has been some really wonderful editorial work done on a couple chunks of this, but they're in hard to find or expensive editions. And so we're really trying to, on one level, just make this findable online. And so part of the editing that we're doing is coding and making a computer able to read, instead of the plain text that would just be like everything typed out in a text file, but make a computer browser able to display this as it would look on the original page, so that it knows where a paragraph begins and ends, and it knows that this is a speaker and this is in italics, and this is poetry and here's where the line breaks are. So that's sort of the basic coding that we did, which was sort of textual and bibliographical, like just the parts of the book and the parts of the text. And then the next layer that we're adding in is thinking about all these kind of semantic elements, these elements of the meaning that we could code in as well. And that to me is where it gets really fun, because we can think about what might a researcher want to be able to find easily in these 20 numbers that they could again extract and do something with. And so some of it was fairly straightforward. Like we were tagging our foreign languages, and we were finding like, okay, every time there's some French, let's tag that French, and given the importance of this text as a Scottish text, every time there's a character who speaks in Scots, that got tagged as well. And that's the character James Hogg, or the Ettrick Shepherd, almost exclusively speaks in Scots, so his lines get tagged. And then we thought about adding additional layers in terms of works that get referenced, historical people that get referenced, even things. Seth was devising a really interesting system for thinking about ways that characters interrupt each other in the dialogue, and can we kind of taxonomize the types of interruptions and then therefore say something interesting about that. And so we were having a lot of fun thinking about what are the different opportunities that we could give researchers coming to this text to either extract easily from it the things that they're interested in, or engage more deeply with the form of the text itself.
Yeah, thank you for that. That helps a lot. Let's turn to the students now and get your experiences. Like, what was it you worked on? And you can just kind of take turns talking about these. Whoever wants to go first can jump in. But what was it? What piece of this project were you working on, and what skills did you learn? And what were some surprises as you encountered this material?
Can I share mine? Yeah. I don't remember. What was I Noctes 4? So I had Noctes 4, and mine was the infamous Byron issue that we've been talking about, because we've established like the editors and the audience of the Noctes really had a problem with Byron. Like, he was a radical, he was scandalous, he had like everything, like he was just their perfect enemy. He comes up so frequently, like he's just, they're like, whenever they need someone to punch, Byron shows up. My Noctes was a fictionalized meeting between O'Doherty and Byron at a pub in Italy. Absolutely hilarious, because they're they're characterizing Byron in a way that, like would drive him insane, right? Like they're making him say things that are ethnically prejudiced against Italians. They're making him say things that are classist. They're putting a lot of words in his mouth that are like just I mean, he obviously had bigger fish to fry, but if he did get around to reading it, he was probably just like face palming the entire time. But interestingly, what I thought was there's something about the Noctes that like they are actively like trying to create something that's entertaining and funny, and they'll do that at the expense of others' reputations. But they do offer Byron the chance to defend himself. They have this scene where the two characters are sort of debating about one of Byron's pieces. It's not coming to mind now. It's been a couple months since we were working on this, but they offer him an extensive amount of lines of dialogue where he's posing his argument and defending himself against O'Doherty, who's representing the claims of his critics. And I find that really fascinating because although like the magazine takes a very obvious stance in terms of politics and also literature, they are willing to acknowledge perhaps some of the valid claims that their opposing writers and politicians may have, which I think is kind of cool. It was also a good laugh just to imagine like how ridiculous it is to have like an actual historical figure. Like this is a person, right, in the world, and you're just like creating this like comic sketch of them and their actions. I mean, obviously stuff like that happens in our media today, but there was just something so funny about that. And like, I just really loved it. I think even like I can speak for everyone, like reading these Noctes in the way that they're written, they're really like fun to read. So it was definitely like interesting and different.
Yeah. So I worked on the third installment of the Noctes, and to kind of give you a picture of how racy these installments really were, the subject matter of mine was a dinner party where each member of the dinner party gets progressively more offended by the others, and one by one they begin to leave until we just have a handful of people left on stage. And I thought that was really entertaining. It gives us a handful of editorial problems, I would say, because when we enter the scene where the dinner party is taking place, what happens on paper is there is a diagram that looks to be almost hand-drawn or something like that. And it's essentially a table, and it has, so-and-so is sitting here, and it has the entire thing laid out. And it's like, oh, great. How do we put this, on computer? And there's all these other, these wonderful things that are going on. And what we get is a very boisterous environment where people are talking over each other. And to add on to that comparison between this piece and, blog posts is that you have in both cases a sense of anonymity. You have this veil of, one is I'm behind a screen, and the second is the people who wrote this can just claim, well, it's just a play. These are just characters. And what that allows them to do is give these really scolding, scathing takes and then hide behind the plausible deniability of, well, this is just a conversation that happened between a bunch of fictional people. We don't really believe this. And that gives the Noctes a lot of artistic liberties that other pieces don't necessarily have. And it also, the energy of it gives it a performative aspect where it feels very alive. And we talked about this with Professor Woody. There's nothing to suggest that people weren't buying these installments and then, reading them and pseudo performing them in their homes with each other, because it's laid out such that each character has their own parts, and it's pretty clear and, very much like a play. And, that could have been happening. And I think that's a really cool thing to think about.
Yeah, I want to piggyback off of like the first, the performance aspect. I had one of the pieces with a lot of songs in it. And, that brought to mind, I mean, for one, I remember when I first looked at my piece, I was like, I would love to somehow figure out how to like code for the songs, not code for the songs, but like, plug them into GarageBand and see like, how did these songs, how were they meant to sound? And were these meant to be performed out loud, or were people just supposed to like read them and then go about their days? So, the performance aspect of the Noctis is very interesting. And then also to piggyback off of the topic of like class issues in the Nocta, I worked on two pieces. So I had the one, and the second one I worked on actually had to do, it was all about the king. It was just, there was a lot of discussion about the king, but a lot of it was like, praising the king and stuff. And there was a bit of discussion there about like, why are they talking so nicely about the king? Is it really because they have these positive opinions on the king? Or was it because there was potential that the king could like cut down this whole issue in one fell swoop if there was anything suspicious in there, And that piece actually, like, interestingly enough, had like some like, lower class people in the end kind of talking, giving their opinions on what they thought about not only the king, but like, broader societal issues. So you got a little bit of perspective from, not just these different authors in the literary world, but also like other like real people, other people who would be in the world who would like have opinions on everything going on. And I thought that was really, really fascinating.
So I had I believe the second issue, and what I think the biggest takeaway I had, kind of going off of the content, because I would definitely say my issue was the least technically involved. There was the least amount of foreign languages, the least amount of made-up languages, and it was just involved a much smaller group of characters. But what I had and I thought this was a really engaging and like eye-opening part of the process, was going through every allusion they made, whether it be to person, written text, another magazine, and looking up, were these real or were they fictional? Because as we talked about with characters, there are personas being put on, and there is a bit of this play aspect to it, and the same thing, but to a lesser degree, happens with the works expressed and alluded to. And just like on a personal note, after having, went through and coded a lot of the works that I was able to find and properly identify, the amount of times that those names have come up in my classes this semester, and just like my outside reading, I would never have, put two and two together. But in my senior seminar with Dr. Woody, we have to read a lot of scholarship, and I see mention of the Quarterly Review, and which I had never heard of or had never thought much of, because I had no experience with them, and reference to the Edinburgh Review, even like Lord Byron, I wasn't familiar with until he's discussed so heavily in these Noctes issues. And seeing how this magazine, as much as it was comical and there was a lot of thought-provoking things brought up, it is a very literate heavy publication. And I know the first time I read it, it was a little difficult, because so much is being alluded to that if you don't understand what work they're referencing, it can just go over your head, because a lot of these texts have like historical and political factors that influence, the characters of the Noctes to talk about them and bring them into their arguments. It just amazed me how detailed and thorough they just discussed these works. And every other sentence, I mean, they were making allusions that even in modern conversation, if I'm talking with a friend, I might bring in to reference a movie or a book or a TV show, but it's usually for one thing, and then you move on. But these characters in the Noctes are just, that's how they communicate with each other. And because, as we've talked about, there's so much political tension around this time between the Whigs and the Tories, how do certain authors that they're discussing align with their political views or push away from the ideals that they're trying to put on a platform? Seeing how, it kind of influenced like everyday aspects of these characters, whether they were real or fake, it just had such a profound effect. I don't think I've ever seen that in any other form of entertainment before, where it's so dependent on the tradition that it was built on, if that makes sense.
Would the word intertextuality belong in this conversation, Christine?
I think so, definitely. Why not, right? Of course, there's that. But I think what Stefan is getting at might be if we even pushed it further than intersexuality and said, there's a way in which the medium through which these guys communicate on some level is illusion. Whether it's literary illusion or like personal illusion to like something about somebody's life. That seems to be the way these characters are written, that the way they talk. It's on some level like if you were in a group chat where everybody only sent memes to each other. That's kind of like what the experience of this text is, right? They cannot talk about anything. They can't even talk about what they want to eat without referencing a work of literature, that's somehow their lingua franca. And so in that sense, it's this hyper literate community. And it's highly, highly artificial, right? I feel like that's one of the things for me that's so important. It's like this extreme performance, extreme artifice that the reader is invited to kind of enter into and almost aspire to. And it does feel like what Jattu was saying about the songs, right? Like, are people not supposed to hang out with their friends? I mean, there's no TV, so why not? Let's get out the piano and play this song and we can all sing it, right? Like, it would seem that we do that kind of stuff now with like a TikTok dance or whatever. So why wouldn't it have been done by bored people in 1823? And so I think that there's that sense that this culture, this highly literate, highly exuberant culture is presented to this audience as aspirational, that you would want to be these guys. You would be a cool, interesting person if you could get invited to one of these parties.
Yeah, I just want to comment really quickly on how natural the dialogue is. Like, there's so much world building involved in these like encounters that they're writing about. Like, even mine, like not only would they be talking about like debates within the literary world, but they're talking about what alcohol they like. They're talking about like different songs that they know, different people that they know personally. And all of these things like can be seen as elements that are being very purposefully used to create like a sense of like group membership within the readers. Because we've talked a lot about how there's a huge like population of people who are going to be reading this. They're from different social classes, but maybe the same party affiliation. How do you bridge the gaps and experiences between those classes in a way that lets people feel unified with one another while acknowledging the really strict social hierarchy that Tories believe in? So very, very interesting stuff.
And one last quick question. Is there any evidence on how these magazine numbers were received? Like, was it kind of like everyone knew it was fictional? Like a reader, it was like wink, wink. That isn't really Lord Byron. Like, it was sort of obvious, or was it more like a deep fake where, oh, well, maybe Lord Byron really did say that, or the king, or whoever? Like, I'm just kind of curious as to what evidence there is. Is it because you've read these things? I haven't. Like, is it sort of so obvious that it's what they're up to or not?
Yeah, there's a sliding there's a spectrum. And Byron would be at one end of the spectrum where it's like the audience knows it's not really Byron. Like, any audience member who's paying attention at all knows it's not Byron. It's like, I don't know, I'm not going to come up with a good analogy quickly enough, but it's like the political stances at that point are so far separate that it doesn't really make sense. And geographically, like, they even say at the beginning of that number, like, transferred by poetic license to Pisa. So they're winking at that fictionality there. And there are places where it's overtly courting the fictional. So I think there's that end of the spectrum. But then the other end of the spectrum is the people who are believably, maybe they did say that. And two examples of this. One is this guy called the Odontist. He's a character who appears, he's based on a dentist from Glasgow. The guy had no hand at all in the publication of this magazine, but he thought it was hilarious that they kept putting him in it. So he would get invited to dinner parties, like as the Odontist, and he would go, even though he doesn't know any of these people particularly well and is not actually the Odontist as he's depicted in the magazine. Another example is actually James Hogg, the Ettrick Shepherd. He's originally one of the writers of the magazine, but I have a piece that came out last year talking about the James Hogg persona in particular as an instance of sort of like performance and performativity issues, because over the years, Hogg is not writing, but they're still writing the Hogg character. And they make Hogg increasingly do things and say things that he would not say and do. And we actually have in his correspondence, him writing letters to his old friends being like, you need to stop making me do these things because you're embarrassing my family. And of course, they don't stop. They're like, no, again, you're drunk and like running around naked and not. Okay. And so I think there's that range, right? Where in some cases with someone like the King, with someone like Lord Byron, they're so huge, it didn't happen. But somewhere in the middle, you have that brief moment where you go, wait, maybe this person did really say this. Maybe they know something I don't know about them. So it's a spectrum.
Well, you've done your job. You got me totally hooked on this. I want to read it desperately now. It just sounds fascinating. And I look forward to it coming out someday, and hopefully you'll let us know and we'll spread the good news when it's published and out there in cyberspace someplace. For any Widener students who are intrigued by this conversation, are there open avenues in the spring semester or beyond to kind of get into textual editing and these kinds of matters?
Absolutely there are. So one, I'm teaching a course called English 388 this spring, and it is theory and praxis of editing. So we'll be doing some editorial theory for the first half of the term, looking at issues in classic sort of editing questions like authorial intention, looking at feminist editing questions and anti-racist editing questions. And then in the second half of the term, we'll do two hands-on editorial projects. And one of them will be helping on this edition, and the other one will be doing a poetry anthology project with the Green Collection at Widener. So if you're liking this when you're listening to this, I would be thrilled to have you in English 388, or just reach out to me about the Textual Scholarship Certificate Program. And I guess I'll say verbally my email, but I'm cmwoody, WOODY @widener.edu.
That's great. So thanks, Stefan, Jattu, Seth, and Cloë, and Christine for like a very edifying conversation about this. I'm very excited about what you're working on, and I'm sure you learned a tremendous amount. And thanks for joining the English Suite.
To learn more about the topics discussed in this show, check out our blog, englishsuitepodcast.blogspot.com. The English Suite is produced by Jim Esch and a staff of dedicated students at Widener University. You can find the podcast at anchor.fm, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcast directories. We would love to hear your feedback, announcements, and suggestions. Send an email to widenerenglishsuite@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.